This is the moment Donald Trump has been dreading. Not the depositions, not the headlines, not the protests. Exposure. This morning, the stunt he and the MAGA machine carefully staged, dragging Bill and Hillary Clinton into Epstein-related depositions, is blowing up into a catastrophic miscalculation. Because instead of targeting old political enemies, the questions are now zeroing in on something far more dangerous to Trump. Missing FBI 302 interview records from verified survivors who allege he sexually assaulted them when they were minors. Let's be crystal clear. These are official Department of Justice interview summaries, and they are missing. Up to 50% of key Epstein files reportedly gone from the archive manifest, including documentation tied to a survivor whose allegations directly implicate Trump. That's not a clerical error. That's potential obstruction territory. That's legal annihilation if proven. And you can see the panic setting in. His allies are not forceful. They're evasive. We're looking into it. We don't know yet. That is the language of a regime scrambling to contain damage, not a movement confident in the truth. Remember, this is the same man found civilly liable for sexual assault, the same man whose name appears tens of thousands of times in the released Epstein materials. And now, under his administration's watch, records involving minors are vanishing? That's not coincidence. That's a nightmare scenario unfolding in real time. This isn't politics anymore. This is what it looks like when the walls are closing in, and the cover-up is starting to fracture under its own weight. Let's talk about the lie. Because for years, Donald Trump and his MAGA enablers have been repeating the same tired script. Nothing to see here. No connection. Fake news. The Democrats are hiding the files. That was the narrative. That was the gaslighting campaign. Trump publicly distanced himself from Epstein once the heat got uncomfortable. He pretended he barely knew the man. His allies framed the entire Epstein scandal as some Democratic blackmail operation. They swore up and down that if Republicans ever took control, they would release everything. Total transparency, full sunlight, no secrets. Now fast forward to today. Republicans control the Oversight Committee. Trump's DOJ has released selective batches of documents. And what are reporters asking? Not about the Clintons, about missing FBI 302s. Let me show you how this collapses under its own weight. When James Comer is asked directly whether there is a cover-up involving accusations against Trump tied to a minor, he doesn't say, absolutely not, we've verified every file. He doesn't say, the records are complete. He says, they're looking into it. That's not confidence, that's hedging. And here's the contradiction that exposes the whole scheme. Comer boasts that Republicans have released tens of thousands of documents, millions of pages, thousands of videos and images. He brags about transparency. But if you're releasing millions of documents, how exactly do 302 interview summaries from verified survivors disappear from the archive manifest? Documents don't just evaporate. Official FBI summaries don't just misplace themselves. Either they were there and removed, or they were never included in the release pipeline to begin with. Both scenarios are catastrophic for Trump's credibility. And then you have Democratic members standing outside the deposition saying plainly, we've seen the manifest. We've verified that interview entries are missing. We're talking about 50% of files unaccounted for. 50%. That's not a rounding error. That's systemic. Meanwhile, MAGA Republicans are trying to pivot back to Bill Clinton's proximity to Epstein, as if proximity is the new standard. Really? Because if proximity is the metric, then we need to talk about Trump's own documented relationship. The photos, the parties, the quotes, the praise. The fact that his name reportedly appears tens of thousands of times in released material. They wanted a spectacle. What they're getting is scrutiny. And scrutiny is the one thing this movement cannot survive. Now we get into the part they do not want you focusing on. Because when you strip away the theater in Chappaqua, the cameras, the performative outrage, the partisan posturing, what matters are the documents, the paper trail, the archive manifest. And this is where it starts getting ugly. I want you to imagine we're sitting there with the DOJ file index in front of us. Page after page of cataloged materials tied to the Epstein investigation. Interview summaries, evidence logs, cross-referenced entries. Now look at this. According to members who reviewed the archive manifest, specific FBI 302 interview summaries connected to a verified survivor, someone alleging abuse as a minor, are listed in earlier internal tracking references, but not present in the publicly released compilation. Let me say that again. Listed in the tracking system, missing from the release. That is not speculation. That is a discrepancy. And when Congressman Garcia stands outside and says they have reviewed the DOJ files and the manifest and confirmed that entries tied to a survivor making serious allegations against both Epstein and President Trump are gone, that's not partisan spin. That's a documented gap in federal records. Gross. You cannot make this up. We are talking about FBI 302s. For those who don't know, those are formal summaries written by federal agents documenting interviews. They are not gossip. They are not blog posts. They are official records created during criminal investigations. So when 302s tied to allegations involving minors vanish from a release that is supposedly about full transparency, the question becomes unavoidable. Who removed them? When? And under whose authority? Because here's what we know from the public reporting. Republicans are boasting that 65,000 documents have been released. The DOJ has reportedly released thousands of videos, hundreds of thousands of images, and millions of pages overall. Millions. And yet, at the same time, lawmakers are saying up to 50% of relevant Epstein-related files remain unreleased or missing from the accessible archive. 50%. That's not a clerical oversight. That's systemic suppression, if accurate. And while this is happening, Trump allies are doing media rounds claiming Democrats weren't interested when Biden was president. That's magical thinking, because this isn't about partisan curiosity. This is about a verified survivor whose interview summary appears to have existed and now doesn't. You want to talk about context? Let's add context. Donald Trump has already been found civilly liable for sexual assault in a court of law. A jury concluded he sexually abused and defamed a woman. That is not a rumor. That is a legal finding. Now overlay that with reports that his name appears tens of thousands of times across released Epstein materials. And now overlay that with missing interview records tied to minors. This isn't coincidence stacking up randomly. This is exposure risk. And here's the deeper problem for Trump. Once you create the expectation of total transparency, once you frame yourself as the one who will release everything, any omission becomes suspicious by default. If they had never promised sunlight, they wouldn't be trapped in their own rhetoric. But they did. They said they would release it all. They said Democrats were hiding it. They said Republicans would be different. And now the archive itself is raising questions. That's why you're seeing the deflection. That's why you're seeing the pivoting to Bill Clinton. That's why you're suddenly hearing about Greenland and Arctic strategy and Cuba and NATO icebreakers. Distraction is the oldest play in the book, but the paper trail is stubborn. If FBI 302s tied to minors were documented and are now missing from a transparency release, that's not politics anymore. That's potential obstruction territory. And that's why this story is not going away. This is the part where the legal exposure begins to eclipse the political theater. And that is precisely what has them panicking. And here's where this stops being an isolated scandal and starts looking like systemic decay. Because what we're witnessing isn't just a document discrepancy. It's a pattern. A regime that is constantly lurching from one manufactured outrage to the next, desperately trying to outrun accountability. While questions are mounting about missing DOJ files, what are Trump's allies doing? They're flooding the zone with noise. Greenland, Cuba, Iran, Arctic warfare, icebreakers, strategic dominance. It's like watching a man ranting and raving, throwing darts at a globe, hoping nobody notices the legal fire alarm going off behind him. One day it's, we need to take Greenland. The next it's, strangle the Cuban regime. Then it's saber-rattling about Arctic deployments and record-length carrier tours stretching military resources thin. This is supposed to be the peace through strength crowd. It looks more like chaos through desperation. And let's not ignore the optics. You have a former president found civilly liable for sexual assault. You have his name reportedly saturating Epstein-related materials. You have verified survivor interview summaries allegedly missing from DOJ releases. And instead of sober leadership, you get media surrogates blaming Biden for everything. Everything is Biden. Missing files? Biden. Transparency gaps? Biden. Political fallout? Biden. That's not strategy. That's regression. Meanwhile, the broader cracks are showing. Trump's public appearances increasingly drift into grievance-fueled rambling. The rhetoric grows darker, more unhinged. He's ranting about enemies, obsessing over loyalty, lashing out at anyone who questions him. This isn't disciplined leadership. It's a fragile ego under siege. And look at the business record. Casinos bankrupt. Trump stakes vanished. Trump University shut down. Charity dissolved. A trail of collapsed ventures that all share the same pattern: hype, deflection, blame, failure. Now overlay that pattern onto governance. When pressure mounts, distract. When scrutiny builds, attack. When facts corner you, claim conspiracy. But here's the problem. The electorate is watching. Recent polling on generic congressional ballots shows Democrats leading. Viewership numbers for major Trump addresses are sagging compared to past cycles. The spectacle fatigue is real. People are tuning out the chaos and tuning in to accountability. This isn't just about Epstein files. It's about credibility erosion. It's about a movement that promised strength but delivers instability, that promised transparency but now faces missing records, that promised law and order but is constantly brushing up against legal jeopardy. And when you zoom out, it starts to look like late-stage unraveling. Because strong movements don't need constant distraction. They don't need geographic fantasy wars to change the subject. They don't need to rewrite reality in real time. This doesn't feel like dominance. It feels like the beginning of the endgame, where legal exposure, public fatigue, and political backlash converge. This is not a one-off mistake. It's a flashing warning light that the system built around one man's ego is cracking under pressure. And when systems built on personality start cracking, they rarely stabilize. They fracture. And here's the bottom line. This is the difference between truth and power games, between accountability and protection rackets, between democracy and a cabal scrambling to shield itself from exposure. If FBI records tied to minors are missing, the American people deserve answers. If transparency was promised, then transparency must be delivered. Not selectively, not strategically, not only when it's politically convenient. This isn't about left versus right. It's about whether powerful people get to manipulate the justice system when the heat gets too close. No distractions, no Greenland fantasies, no magical thinking about millions of pages released. If even one verified survivor's official interview summary was removed or withheld, that is a line that cannot be crossed in a democracy that claims to believe in the rule of law. We cannot allow political loyalty to override accountability. If you want fearless coverage that doesn't flinch when the story gets uncomfortable, hit subscribe. Let's push this channel past the next milestone and keep independent media strong. Because sunlight is powerful. And right now, someone looks terrified of it.